MacGyver. Hello.
Hey.
Welcome to Founding Feckheads. In this sub-podcast of The Jib, we look at the dark side of the founding fathers of the United States. Our first founding feckhead was George Washington. Our second founding feckhead was John Adams. Our third founding feckhead was Thomas Jefferson. And our fourth founding feckhead is James Madison. Now, we don't hear a lot about James Madison other than constantly being mentioned in the background as one of the writers of the Constitution. But nevertheless, you probably hear his name a lot. He gave his name to Madison Square Garden, Madison Avenue, also the capital city of Wisconsin, and The Mermaid in the 10th highest grossing film of 1984, I am informed by Wikipedia, Splash. And that mermaid took her name from Madison Avenue. Madison Avenue is also the mad part of Mad Men.
Yeah.
Directly as a result of Splash, there were almost no girls called Madison before 1984, but by 2001 it was the second most popular name for baby girls in the United States. I'm sure James Madison would be proud. Now, normally in our Founding Feckheads, we present the careers of early American politicians chronologically, but there will be even more bouncing around time and space than usual in this episode, because it's the only way I could make it in any way entertaining. So join us on our merry journey.
So we're going to talk about something that we generally don't talk much about in school history, American history, that is, the War of 1812. And I'm not talking about the overture. Perhaps the biggest and most obvious mistake. Well, you know what? Should have done this. That's the prick we're talking about right now, by the way.
That's James Madison.
That's James Madison.
The thoughtful gentleman.
Yep.
The philosopher king.
Yeah. Get a real good look at him.
Yeah.
Curmudgeon. So, anyways, so perhaps the biggest and most obvious mistake made by our dearly beloved James was declaring war on England. Although there had been ocean-based tensions between England and the U.S., it's a big step to declare war. And indeed, every single Federalist in Congress voted against it, which is kind of shocking. You think about some of the guys in that party, right?
Yes.
In 1812, Madison sent a message to Congress, which said, firstly, the British ships, quote, have been in the continued practice of violating the American flag on the great highway of nations and seizing and carrying off persons sailing under it. And further that, our commerce has been plundered in every sea. The great staples of our country have been cut off from the legitimate markets.
Now, we should probably point out that is technically true. Like, he didn't make that up, but there's more.
Right. However, this second war of independence, as it's been called, was far from the brave stand against British tyranny its supports promoted. Even at the time, it was generally understood American politicians that this war was more about cynical land grabs and United States expansion at the expense of the Native Americans and British Canadians. Many Federalists were angry that the administration was targeting England itself, instead of France, who had also been attacking American ships, perhaps even more so. They believed the real enemy was Napoleon. I don't know why they'd be like that. Described by one party member. What's that?
The Federalists believed the real enemy was Napoleon. By the way, if you wonder what the hell we're talking about Federalists, we cover this in the first episode about George Washington and also the second one. There's two parties in America right now, the Federalist Party and the Democrat-Republican, which is one party. So that's what we're talking about Federalists for.
They described Napoleon, one member of the party described him as a arch-fiend who has long been the curse and scourge of the European world.
Fair.
Napoleon had offered to end attacks on American ships if the United States pushed against to punish any who did not offer similar protections, but were on attacking American ships anyways. New England merchants were so angry at their shouldering most of the burden on the war over the more ineffective slave-owning states, shocker. They held a convention in Hartford, Connecticut, where one serious suggestion was succession of the New England from the United States. Rufus King, great fucking name. Great fucking name.
Isn't it?
Yeah. The ambassador to England said, quote, regarded the war as a war of party, not of country. In practice, James Madison was a terrible leader, or terrible war leader, I should say, and perhaps charitable to describe him as not built for combat. He completely underestimated English military strength. He overestimated the ability and capacity of the United States to wage war, and he ignored all the warnings from increasingly outraged Federalists. Again, Federalist on the side of, not being
Yeah,
on the side of war is just,
it was something weird happened there.
yeah, you
Yeah,
just read this, right? Um, who of course, were proven correct. The failures of Madison's administration to properly prepare meant that the U.S. entered the war with a small, unequipped standing army and relied on poorly trained states militias who were often operating under what can charitably be described as competing operating assumptions. Yeah, I mean, he was openly against the standing army or having any sort of militia or doing
yeah,
any sort of, the groundwork or infrastructure work.
yep.
You know,
Right up until
yeah, he was cutting it off the heels even before his administration took it. This is
oh
something
yeah,
that he was,
before he was Secretary of State,
yeah,
and in that capacity, he also did reduce the army, and that was the Jefferson
hmm
policy. Yeah, well, it turns out
yeah,
you need an army to fight a war.
yeah. Which, if you're the one saying you want a war, maybe you
Yeah,
should have. Yeah,
well,
the naval. Go ahead.
you'll see what happened
Okay.
here.
Yeah. The naval blockade established by the English military in response to the U.S. aggression devastated American trade, leading to widespread unemployment and economic hardship, especially in New England. Wealthy merchants and financiers, many of whom opposed the war, were still able to insulate themselves while the economic downturn fell hardest on laborers, artisans, and
By the way, this is pretty
subsistence
much,
farmers, rather.
this is pretty much true of every war everywhere.
Right.
Wealthy merchants and financiers, many of whom opposed the war, were stable to insulate themselves. That's a common thing. And the economic downturn will fall hardest on laborers, women, poor people, subsistence farmers.
Yep. Same as it ever was.
Same as it ever was.
Yep. If it was working class, it was working class men who were conscripted, drafted, in other words, right?
Yep.
Taxed and died while elite profited from government contracts and land speculation. One of Madison's greatest miscalculations was assuming that an invasion of Canada would be swift and popular. For one thing, he expected Canadians to rise in rebellion against the British rule, a disastrous miscalculation, right?
Yes.
Instead of support, U.S. Forces encountered stiff resistance, and the campaign turned into a costly series of failures. Perhaps the most damaging aspect of Madison's war strategies was its devastating impact on Native Americans. There were pretty much paved over to allow for accelerated settler expansion
Sorry,
into the
sorry, Seamus.
Midwest.
Seamus gave me all this text, right? He
Uh,
gave me all this information, and I rewrote some of the sentences without telling him. So he
yeah,
seemed
it's okay.
the first time. Like Seamus would never say the phrase ever.
No,
A perhaps charitable response. He just goes straight in and say this and that. So that's
yeah,
why that's what's happening here.
it's all good.
Sorry, Seamus.
It's all right. To allow accelerated settler expansion into the Midwest, and it cemented the genocidal trajectory of the United States. Yeah, that's a fun way I've heard about a phrase. Yeah.
Yeah.
This outcome was not incidental. It was central objective of the war. The U.S. aimed to eliminate native resistance to settler colonization, colonialism rather, because they wanted the land. Another grievance they had against England was English support of Native American resistance to settler colonialism.
By the
Which
way,
is
we'll find out
interesting.
later that the English support for the Native American resistance was not just about the fact that the Native Americans were fighting against America. There was a certain principle behind it, even for England. And if England have better principles than you do, your
Yeah.
ass in trouble.
Yeah. Hey, we found out about slaves as well. Like whenever they would, free them
Yeah,
during the Revolutionary War, and then they wanted their property back right
yeah,
afterwards. And a lot of English people were like, "No, fuck you! I gave this guy my protection. He's still gonna have my protection." So,
yeah.
yeah. The war accumulated in English capture of Washington in August 1814, where British forces sacked the Capitol and burned down the White House, which we have a
We have a photo of
photo
that.
of.
Maybe saying burnt down is a bit of an exaggeration, but you can see that's a painting a guy did straight after it got burnt out. It was definitely burnt
Oh,
out. You can see there's smoke coming out of all those windows.
wasn't a
They're black.
photograph?
No, that's a painting.
Oh, okay.
Hmm.
Oh, okay. Didn't have a Kodak, I guess, or an iPhone.
No, did not have the Polaroid at that point.
Anyways, they sacked Capitol, burned the White House and the United States Treasury, the Washington Navy Yard, and the state Capitol building. Over 3,000 volumes. Did I just hear Timmy?
Yeah. Timmy, come here. No, it's
Yep,
not yet.
they fucked off.
Yeah.
Over 3,000 volumes in the Library of Congress were destroyed in a fire. The actions forced Madison to flee. A final humiliation in the war, full of embarrassments, a low point in American history. After a decisive American victory at New Orleans under Andrew Jackson, that fucker.
Yeah, but in fairness to
Yeah.
him, that was a decisive American victory, and he was
Yep.
good at that. We can't take that away. That wasn't.
He was good at war. He was good
Yeah,
at killing people. He's really good at killing Native Americans.
yeah.
So, unfortunately.
That's we will probably find out in a future episode.
Yeah. The British were motivated to settle the war, after which the entire Federalist Party collapsed due to their opposition to the war. Now being heavily promoted as an American victory, which is definitely one way to look at it. Peace treaty was signed in Get Belgium in 1815, restoring to pre-war borders of June 1812. Due to the American refusal to discuss the Native Americans, one English negotiator said, quote, I had until I came here had no idea of the fixed determination which prevails in the breast of every American to extricate yeah, the Indians and appropriate their territory.
Extirpate is a word that means take. It's you use it about plants. You take them up by the root.
Yeah, I just never.
That's extirpate.
Canadian historian Pierre Baton said in 1981, quote, it was as if no war had been fought, or to put it more bluntly, as if the war that was fought for no good reason. For nothing has changed. Everything as it was from the beginning.
So the Americans won the war. Technically, they achieved pretty much zero of their war aims. So I don't know. You decide whether it was good or not. He was lucky. He got lucky in that.
Oh yeah.
They burnt down that house, and they burnt down a whole bunch of stuff in the Capitol, and it was embarrassing and stupid. And that was James Madison's fault. Yep. That wasn't an accident. He did that. It wasn't bad luck. It was poor decision making.
Awesome.
All right. Now the rest of this podcast will be a series of quotes by James Madison and about James Madison. Here we go. This is a quote from James Madison. The advancement and diffusion of knowledge is the only guardian of true liberty. Now, while a well-educated people is essential to any functional democracy, there is little doubt that James Madison took this one step further into a kind of intellectual elitism. Madison opposed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which he went into some detail on our previous Founding Feckheads episode about John Adams. However, Madison's own administration curtailed civil liberties during the War of 1812. Another quote is, a popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both. Newspapers critical of the war were harassed or shut down. Anti-war protests, particularly in New England, were demonized as unpatriotic or treasonous, if that sounds familiar to anyone.
Yeah.
The Hartford Convention, a peaceful gathering of Federalists who opposed the war, was used as a political scapegoat and contributed to the party's demise. Madison's tolerance for dissent was conditional. When dissent came from the elites, it was a reasoned debate, and when it came from workers, abolitionists, or the poor, it was dangerous factionalism. He had a thing about factions, as you will recall. Now, the third quote we have is, knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives. And I know these are all kind of the same idea, but bears repeating. In 1812 in Baltimore, a Federalist newspaper called Federal Republican published editorials critical of Madison's decision to declare war. Pro-war activists rioted in the streets, attacked the newspaper offices on multiple occasions, and eventually leveled the building and destroyed the printing press. The editor moved to a friend's house and published the newspaper from there. The pro-war mob found him and laid siege to the house. They were only prevented from setting off the field artillery they had parked in the front garden by the arrival of the mayor. The editor and some of his staff were taken to jail for their own protection, but the pro-war mobs broke into the jail. The editor was severely beaten, one writer was killed, and another was tarred, feathered, and dragged around Baltimore in the back of a cart. This is in relation to the quote I just gave you. Federalists believed the violence was specifically aimed at intimidating anyone, anywhere, who challenged President Madison's war declaration. And I don't think that's oversensitive an interpretation.
No, but and I know I'm beating a dead horse in this, but I mean, so Hamilton is pretty much, if somebody needs an understanding of the Federalist Party, they always point to Hamilton as being, that kind of icon or that kind of, somebody who was
Yes.
an ideologue in that. Hamilton was used to explain fascism to the Congress whenever fascism rose up in Europe
Yeah.
back in the the early night
Yeah.
last 20th century. So it's just saying that Madison himself was such a fascist in many ways that he
Yeah.
fashed the Federalists.
The Federalists were like, "Stop it."
Yeah, it's
Um,
just it's just amazing.
Another quote I have is, this is all Madison now: "A well-instructed people alone can be permanently a free people." Now, this sounds like a good idea. You
Mm-hmm.
want your voters to be informed. However, Madison seemed to believe that only properly educated people should be allowed to vote, and that further, only white landowners could be considered properly
Right.
educated. Now, there's a
It's
whole
out of a
bunch of,
caveat.
yeah, he didn't say any of that, but it's
Yeah.
it's really the only conclusion we can come to based on bunches of other stuff. When he says a well-instructed people, that's what he means.
Well,
Um,
you could say he said that by the way the Constitution was written.
yeah, but if you said
So,
to somebody a well-instructed people alone can be a permanently free
right.
people, I don't think anybody would argue with that.
Sure.
So it's quite a caveat, as he said.
Yeah.
The fifth quote I wrote down is: "The rights of persons, the rights of property, are the objects for the protection of which government was instituted." Right, the rights of persons and the rights of property. Apparently, this government protection did not extend to black people, although he called.
Not
although,
my America.
although at one point he called slavery a moral evil, Madison did nothing to challenge the plantations. There are dark implications that he meant it was a moral evil in the sense that a society so dependent on slave labor was inherently unstable, rather than anything to do with black people.
Yeah,
He
and
owned-
he got away. I mean, pretty well with them. He grew up on a plantation, right?
He did
You know?
called
Yeah, Montpellier.
Montpellier, yeah.
Yeah.
Montpellier, yeah. He owned 100 slaves, and imagine owning 100 people. He owned 100
Wow.
slaves, and during his lifetime, he only freed one, a guy called William Gardner, whom he sold into 7 years of indentured servitude, which is as close as you can get to being a slave without actually being
Yeah.
a slave.
Yeah.
This is a quote: "I have judged it most prudent not to force Billy," the guy, "back to Montpellier, Virginia, even if it could be done," he said. "I am persuaded his mind is too thoroughly tainted to be a companion for fellow slaves in Virginia." So yeah.
Oh, that is so fucking sick.
Oh, absolutely. He took him with him to
Oh.
Philadelphia as a slave, and then he knew the guy was exposed to ideas of freedom and so on, and he didn't want this guy causing trouble back in. But he's so explicit about it. He's not even hiding that this. It's tainted by what? Liberty, by your own fucking ideals.
Jesus
Tainted by
Christ.
your documents.
Yeah.
By
He
your
got to live. He got to live too free.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How
Fuck
shall we
off.
keep him down on the farm now that he's seen Paris?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Madison did everything he could to avoid abolition. He even supported resettling freed slaves in Africa as an alternative. He promoted this idea when he was president of the American Colonization Society in the early 1930s, which I'd never heard of until you told me about it. I never heard about this until you told me about it.
Yeah. What a club, right? What a club.
Yeah, yay. The society was founded in 1816 on the principle that the prevailing view that black people could not integrate into US society. Now, you'll hear this again in a modern context. Certain groups of people cannot integrate. Well, if you keep on telling them that they're different and wrong and bad and they need to fuck off, then yeah, you're the cause of why they cannot integrate,
Yeah.
right? There were also fears, and this might be a bit more on the money, there were also fears that freed slaves hanging around might inspire other slaves to revolt. One critic at the time, that's certainly what happened when he freed Billy instead of having him back on the farm. One critic at the time said of the organization, "We recognize in it the most intense hatred of the colored race, clad in the garb of pretended philanthropy, and we regard the revival of colonization societies as manifestations of a passion fit only for demons to indulge in." So even at the time, they figured it out, right?
Yeah.
As you will be aware, the aims of the American Colonization Society were largely unfulfilled. As far as I know, there's only one country that took off, and that was Liberia, where the freed slaves went back to Africa and did something. Madison initially opposed the Constitution's 20-year protection of the foreign slave trade, but he eventually accepted it as a necessary compromise to get the South to ratify the document. In fact, every single one of Madison's slavery-related actions completely contradicted any of his anti-slavery words, and we have a word for that kind of person, don't we?
Yeah.
Yeah. Madison also argued that slavery should remain under state control and opposed any federal intervention. Sent it back to the states. Yeah. Unlike George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, Madison didn't even free slaves in his will.
Wow.
Yeah. Here's another quote. "I believe that there are more instances of the abridgment of the freedom of the people by gradual and silent encroachments of those in power than by violent and sudden usurpations." Now, Madison's actions in office could be regarded as gradual and silent encroachments of those in power. The one thing he's telling us all to look out for. Madison's philosophical acumen, which we can't deny, he had a philosophical acumen, and he was good at writing and so on, and putting together legal documents. He was good at that.
Yep.
But this did not always translate into effective governance. His failure to build lasting institutions or to guide the fledgling nation through its early crises with consistent principled leadership reflects a disconnect between theory and practice, and that's really his big thing.
Right.
He wrote with insight about the dangers of faction, yet presided over the rise of the first American political party system. He worried about demagoguery and foreign entanglements, and yet his own decisions dragged the country into a poorly managed war that we just spoke about. Rather than pushing for the abolition of slavery or even gradual emancipation, Madison worked behind the scenes to secure Southern interests. This disconnect also extends to his views on the Constitution itself. Madison originally opposed the inclusion of a Bill of Rights, arguing that the structure of government would be sufficient to protect liberties, and he eventually reversed this stance, primarily due to political pressure, and he ended up writing it. Another quote we have from this lovely gentleman is, "The purpose of separation of church and state is to keep forever from these shores the ceaseless strife that has soaked the soil of Europe in blood for centuries." That's fair enough.
Yeah.
Thankfully for the Americans, except for one afternoon in 2001, the ceaseless strife Madison is talking about here has almost exclusively soaked the soil of foreign countries, due in no small part to the actions of the CIA and the State Department that we've discussed in many episodes of the Jib.
Yeah.
So that's not really a commentary on his quote, more than a quick ad for our podcast. Another quote is, "The means of defense against foreign danger historically have become the instruments of tyranny at home." Again, that's fair. Madison was so against the idea of a permanent standing federal army that he proposed the Second Amendment specifically to undermine it. In the years prior to the War of 1812, Jefferson and Madison had accordingly reduced the size of the military, leaving the country with a military force of about 12,000 men, consisting mostly of poorly trained state-based militia members. As soon as the war was declared, Madison asked Congress to quickly put the country into an armor and attitude demanded by the crisis, specifically recommending expansion of army and navy.
Funny how that worked, right?
Well, the quote he has is, he wanted to put the country into an armor and attitude demanded by the crisis. And then my last quote from James Madison is, "Crisis is the rallying cry of the tyrant." Now, here are some quotes about James Madison rather than by him, which I have used again to just talk about him in a way. "Mr. Madison is a little man in all respects but his ambition," which was from John Randolph, a congressman and critic of Madison at the time. Randolph viewed Madison as weak, indecisive, and easily influenced by others. He also called him a political dwarf, which is perhaps especially cruel, as Madison was small in stature.
Yeah.
He stood about 5'4" and weighed around 100 pounds, which for Europeans is 12 shekels, and he weighed around 15 bazungis.
So, like in modern day, he would be like Ross Perot, if anybody remembers that little fucking demon. You know?
Third party candidate, yeah.
Yeah.
Madison was the shortest and lightest US president ever. Another quote is, "Mr. Madison has degraded the office of president into the engine of a faction," which again is ironic given Madison's antipathy to factions.
Right.
This was spoken by Josiah Quincy, a Federalist from Massachusetts. This is in response specifically to Madison's handling of the War of 1812, which New Englanders viewed as a Southern-driven, unnecessary conflict that devastated their commercial interests. The reason they viewed it as a Southern-driven, unnecessary conflict that devastated their commercial interests was because it was, in fact, a Southern-driven, unnecessary conflict that devastated their commercial interests.
Right.
Yeah. Now, my next quote is, "A closet philosopher forced into leadership proved as powerless as a child among the wolves." This quote was by Henry Adams, who wrote The History of the United States of America, 1801 to 1817. He's got a bunch of other history books covering different years. The man was prolific, this Henry Adams character. Many historians, including Adams, were very critical of Madison's leadership during the War of 1812, especially his inability to manage the chaos of war. And that's one of my classic understatements, I think. Especially his inability to manage the chaos. Usually, declaring war results in a bump in approval ratings, right?
Yeah.
Or at least it leads to a greater public perception as a strong, decisive leader, but Madison didn't even get that.
No.
In his 20s, Madison thought he was dying constantly, not from sickness, but from stress and overwork. He wore black all the time, not because he was cool, but because he thought he would die at any moment and felt it was good, just in case, funeral wardrobe.
So he was Goth.
He was Goth before it was cool. Oh, no, wait a second now. That was 18... That would have been like in the 1800s. That's the
Yeah.
real goth time. Like that's your
Yeah.
proper goth time. Yeah.
Yeah. So I one positive thing to say about him, then I guess.
Yeah. He invented goth.
Yeah.
Madison's passions are too much at the mercy of his reason. This quote is by Thomas Jefferson, who was a friend of Madison's, so it's not like he didn't
Yeah.
like him. Jefferson was a friend of Madison's. They wrote letters in cipher using invisible ink, and they made up fake names to talk to each other. So that's nice, right?
That's very high schoolish or
It
middle
is, and
schoolish,
it's not
right?
the only high schoolish thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Uh-huh.
while not exactly an insult, Jefferson was noting Madison's timid nature, that he could be too slow to act or indecisive. He had chronic stage fright, as is common among good writers. He was a good writer. As is common among good writers, he was a terrible public speaker. His speeches were quiet, awkward, and often difficult to hear. Another quote I have is, "He speaks well of liberty, but he means liberty for himself and his class." And
Yeah.
that was by right. That was by Federalist Congressman, a guy called Fisher Ames, who's got another cool name. Over and over again, Madison would change his position on some issue or other because he felt it was necessary to preserve the Southern slaveholder aristocracy, which he felt was the center of the Union. He spoke a big game about republicanism, but delivered the opposite. For instance, in 1791, Madison argued against Hamilton's proposal to set up a national bank. Madison felt that under the Constitution, Congress did not have the power to create a federally empowered national bank. In 1811, Congress allowed the charter of the First Bank of the United States to lapse after Madison declined to save it. However, in 1816, he chartered the Second Bank of the United States himself to handle all the financial operations of Congress. At the time, it was one of the largest corporations in the world, maybe after the East India Company. When Charles Dickens saw the building during his visit to Philadelphia in 1842, he called it the Tomb of Many Fortunes, the Great Catacomb of Investment, the Memorable United States Bank. So that's just one example of several positions that Madison took so strongly. While he didn't just say things, he voted against it, campaigned
Right.
against it, and ended up doing the opposite. While publicly championing agrarian democracy, Madison in practice conceded to the centralized financial power when it became convenient, which of course would be the first time any trouble hit. He readily compromised any principles when elite interests demanded it, which I think is probably the essence of fascism. Many Federalists considered Madison's talk of republicanism a smokescreen for Southern slaveholder aristocracy. And the reason many Federalists considered Madison's talk of republicanism a smokescreen for Southern slaveholder aristocracy is because Madison's talk of republicanism was a smokescreen for Southern slaveholder aristocracy. So I'm taking a leaf out of Seamus's book here, not fucking around with the language, yeah? Another quote is, "Madison understood democracy as incompatible with concentrations of wealth. He feared democracy might take hold," and that's by our old friend Noam Chomsky.
Noam.
Noam. Madison, who's still alive. Good for
Yeah.
you, Noam. Madison's role at the Constitutional Convention of 1787 was pivotal. He authored the Virginia Plan, which proposed a strong centralized government with a bicameral legislature, meaning a House of Representatives and a Senate. 2 rooms, right? Bicameral. Madison's constitutional vision was fundamentally anti-democratic. He opposed giving voting rights to the poor or landless. In Federalist Number 10, he warned against factions again, by which he meant popular movements of working class people. Madison also, oh Christ almighty, you can see this bit. Madison also supported, the more I read about this, the less I like it, guys. Just gonna be straight here. Madison also supported the 3/5 compromise, one of the most grotesque political math problems ever invented. A slave counted as 3/5 of a person, not for any good reason, but to count as proxy votes for slaveholders. They couldn't even count as 3/5 of a person for, for just as proxy votes for slaveholders. Madison helped make sure the South got extra seats in Congress by counting people they refused to see as human. It's rough, right?
Good stuff. I mean, wasn't beating around the bush with all that stuff. I mean,
yeah.
Right?
The Constitution, which Madison helped shape, embedded structural inequalities that have outlived him, including the Electoral College, which was originally intended in part to placate smaller slaveholding states. He also, another structural inequality is unequal Senate representation and lifetime judicial appointment mechanisms designed to insulate elites from popular accountability.
Yep, that's working out real fucking well, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, but also not that.
Yeah.
Another quote is, "Madison's theory of government is paper thin, great for essays and dangerous for armies." And who said this was Daniel Webster, a 3-time Secretary of State after Madison. Webster was referring to Madison's ideological idealism, but also his inability to organize anything effectively. He could not organize, as they say, a piss up in a brewery. Madison's preferred management style, and because anytime he did have a piss up, by the way, he got his wife to do it, Dolly.
Yeah.
He obviously had parties in his house, but he left all that to his wife. Madison's preferred management style was characterized by deference to others, including his cabinet and senior military commanders. The president tended to accept infighting among his cabinet members instead of decisively resolving disagreements. We had this problem with George Washington as well, if you remember.
Yeah, exactly. He took the words out of my mouth.
Washington, at least, was a general. Often, the administration seemed at cross purposes with itself. Madison appeared to react to his cabinet rather than lead it. Madison was also inclined to give way to his generals, many of whom were astoundingly inept, including the elderly and unfit William Hull, the excessively cautious Henry Dearborn, and the wholly unprincipled James Wilkinson, which I'm not getting into.
Yeah, we already talked about him under Jefferson.
We did.
So.
I'm getting a big hit of, the famous meme clip from Der Untergang, where the guy playing Hitler says, you, and you, everybody else leave the room,
Yeah.
Getting a big hit of that.
Yeah.
And there's another quote, and this quote is, Madison feared equality as much as tyranny. And this is from a historian called Gary Wills, who has lots of interesting things to say about Madison, but I just picked that one quote. This critique is rooted in Madison's Federalist Number 10, where he warned about majority rule threatening property rights. Yes, majority rule is always going to threaten property rights. That's the problem in many of our CIA episodes. The problem is the majority in the country, in Guatemala or Iran or wherever, decided that they wanted to run the country, and that threatens property rights. Always. Yeah. It's a redistribution of property is a threat to concentrated wealth. Sorry, it just is. Wills pointed out the elitism and distrust of democracy embedded in Madison's philosophy. Because Madison and his administration were characterized by hypocrisy on important issues, elite-driven politics, expansionist greed, the tendency to prioritize political compromise over clarity, and a series of disastrous miscalculations during the War of 1812, James Madison is our fourth founding feckhead. That is our episode on James Madison. How do you feel about that? Do you have any comments to add?
Good. I mean, terrible, actually, but...
Yeah. We got more on him than thought we get, didn't we?
Yeah. I thought we were just going to be looking at, this guy's just a hypocrite, just your typical...
Yeah.
And, oh, shit. He's kind of a fascist.
Yeah.
Fuckwit. Well, most fascists are fuckwits.
And he kept on saying...
As you'll kind of notice today.
Well... If you say that you're interested in justice and freedom and so on, but you completely ignore or even work against the justice and freedom of particular groups, then you are not interested in justice and freedom. And what you're interested in is called privilege.
Yeah, it's a very neoliberal kind of view of things, right?
Yeah, yeah. We take these true. By the way, it's self-evident that all men are created equal, according to these guys.
Yeah. Unless you're black.
Unless you're black or Native American.
Yeah.
Or in James Madison's case, poor.
Yeah.
He didn't. His system would also fuck over poor white people.
Oh yeah. Fucking awesome. Glad so much has changed.
Yeah. Thankfully, we're out of that mess now. We're in Star Trek world now, where all those things are finished.
Utopian. Yay. We just have to worry about the Romulans and the Kardashians.
Yes, we have to watch those guys, the spoonhead motherfuckers.
Yeah.
So that's our show. And in 2 weeks, we will be talking about...
something FBI related, most likely.
Unless it is something else.
We should be watching something FBI related. Let's put it that way. So.
Until then, it's goodbye from us and the Kawaii des James Madison. Kawaii.
See ya.